They told her she didn't belong. At the iron gates of Marlowe House, with her worn coat and battered satchel, Clara Wren was stopped, questioned, nearly turned away. Inside, heirs wrapped in silk and self-importance waited to carve up a dead man's genius. When she was finally allowed in, it was only to be mocked, a ghostwriter failure, a charity case. But while they laughed and tore at the library like wolves, she moved differently. Because hidden behind dust and memory was a secret meant only for her, and when it surfaced, it would bury them all. The iron gates of Marlowe House groaned against the wind, resisting even after the key turned. Age had etched itself into every stone of the old estate, every brick heavy with forgotten stories, every window dulled by decades of dust. Beyond the gates, a gathering brood, suits sharp enough to cut, shoes polished until they mirrored the brittle sky. Clara Wren stood at the threshold, small against the cold metal. Her coat was worn at the elbows, the color faded into uncertain gray. Her boots were scuffed, her satchel a battered thing slung over one shoulder, the strap patched in two places with hand stitching. The guard at the entrance glanced at her, then at the thick stack of invitations he held. His brow creased. "This event is private," he said, not unkind but firm like a door closing. "Family and invited guests only." Clara offered a slip of yellowed parchment, the official notice, its edges curled like old leaves. The guard hesitated, looked her over again, his eyes catching on the scuffed satchel, the unruly strands of hair escaping her simple braid. Behind him, a group of guests arriving on foot swept past, coats flaring, perfumes stinging the air. They barely spared Clara a glance, barely hid their smirks. "She must be lost," one murmured, just loud enough to bleed into the bitter wind. Another laughed, "Maybe she's here for autographs." Their footsteps clacked away across the stone path, sharp and self-assured. The guard shrugged and stepped aside. "Go ahead," but he didn't finish, didn't need to. The silence said it all. Clara entered the estate grounds alone. Marlowe House loomed like a relic too stubborn to fall. Its stone facade was split with hairline fractures, ivy gripping its walls like desperate hands. The Grand Library Annex, where the reading would take place, hunched against the western side, windows shuttered against the pale light. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper, lemon oil, and old ambition. Velvet chairs had been arranged in neat rows before a long mahogany table, behind which sat an unopened leather ledger, thick as a tombstone. Beside it, Mrs. Redgrave, the executor, arranged documents with a precision that left no room for kindness. The guests were already gathering. Polished heirs and silver-tongued scholars murmured in tight circles. Cashmere scarves looped just so, watches gleaming like second suns. They had been bred for this moment, this reading, this inheritance. Clara slipped inside, unnoticed at first, until she wasn't. Eyes found her. Assessed, judged. A man in a navy suit leaned toward his companion, whispering behind a hand, but not quietly enough. Publishing intern, probably. Or one of those sad ghostwriters who think Marlowe left them something in his notebooks. The woman beside him, a sharp figure in a blood-red dress, laughed softly. "Sweetheart, even interns know how to dress for a will." Someone else lifted a phone, pretending to check a text but angling the camera just so, capturing Clara's hunched posture by the door. "Stray among wolves." Already posted before Clara found a seat. No one offered her a place among the polished rows. She found a battered chair near the back, half shielded by a towering bookshelf of cracked leather volumes. She sat quietly, her hands folded around her satchel, no coat removed, no small talk attempted. Across the room, Mrs. Redgrave called the gathering to order with a single sharp tap of her pen against the ledger. Clara's gaze rose to the vaulted ceiling, where faded frescoes of muses and monsters danced in cracked silence. She breathed once, deep and steady. Then she slid her hand into her satchel, and without looking, found the worn edge of a book older than anyone in the room. A book whose secret markings had taught her, long ago, to listen for meaning where no one else heard it. The reading was about to begin, and the wolves didn't even realize the forest already belonged to her. The ledger on the table opened with a slow, ceremonial weight. Mrs. Redgrave adjusted her spectacles and ran one gloved finger down the first page, lips moving in silent count. The guests leaned forward in their chairs, hungry, poised, expectant. Clara stayed still at the back, half shadowed by the towering bookcases, the worn leather of her satchel pressed against her side like armor. Mrs. Redgrave's voice, when it came, was precise and unsentimental. Theodore Marlowe, in his final will, has left no individual bequest of property, assets, or manuscripts to any single heir named by blood or contract. The room rippled with outrage, sharp exhalations, muffled curses, the stiff rustle of expensive fabrics. "Absurd," barked Malcolm Dane, a gray-haired publisher whose empire had once been built on Marlowe's novels. "Impossible," muttered Caroline Westmont, an academic whose lectures on Marlowe filled sold-out halls. Mrs. Redgrave ignored them. She flipped to the next page. Instead, Mr. Marlowe stipulates that the true beneficiary is to be determined by means of discovery. A codicil, a handwritten addendum to his testament, has been hidden somewhere within Marlowe House. Whoever finds and presents it will inherit his full literary estate, including all copyrights, royalties, and unpublished works. Gasps scattered across the room like shattered glass. A man in a tailored pinstripe suit shot to his feet. "This is a farce," he snapped. "He can't make a joke out of a fortune." Mrs. Redgrave simply closed the ledger with a firm thud. "His will is properly notarized, witnessed, and registered. You are free to leave if you decline the terms." No one moved toward the doors. Instead, an ugly energy spread, an almost feral shift. The scramble began quietly at first. Elegant figures slipping from their seats, drifting toward the endless shelves, feigned indifference giving way to thinly veiled desperation. Gloves tugged first editions from their places with none of the reverence they once commanded. Manuscripts tumbled to the floor, spines splitting, pages crumpling under polished shoes. Voices rose. "No codicil here, just worthless drafts. Check the archives upstairs. Rip the margins if you have to." In the chaos, Clara remained seated. A woman with pearl earrings shot her a glare sharp enough to draw blood. "Still here," she hissed. "Don't you have a cosplay convention to crash instead?" A young man, fresh from some publishing house's nepotism track, snickered and snapped a photo of Clara sitting still amid the storm. "Wannabe legacy." Already flooding private message groups before Clara even blinked. One of the cousins, a sleek woman in velvet heels, tossed a battered paperback across the aisle. It landed with a thud at Clara's feet. "Here," she sneered, "maybe you'll find a consolation prize." Laughter rippled. Clara bent slowly, picked up the book, dusted it off with the sleeve of her coat. It was Marlowe's Maps for Wandering Souls, the first edition. The one he used to whisper about when he thought no one was listening. She turned it in her hands, fingers feeling for the familiar notch cut into the back binding. A tiny triangle, almost invisible, pressed into the leather where the spine met the back cover. No one noticed her pause. No one noticed her eyes sharpen. They were too busy devouring the library. She rose quietly, cradling the book against her chest, and moved toward a forgotten corridor where the shelves thickened and the light thinned. Past a brass plaque tarnished by time, the scriptorium, a place not mentioned in the official maps, a place only spoken of once, long ago, between bedtime stories and the scratch of a father's pen. While the polished airs clawed through the obvious, Clara followed the only path that mattered, not the path of blood, not the path of greed, the path of memory. The air changed the moment Clara slipped into the forgotten wing. The library's grandeur faded behind her. No chandeliers, no polished marble, no golden plaques boasting of literary conquests. Only stone and shadow, and the soft groan of ancient timber beneath her boots. The scriptorium, the place her father had once described in half-whispered stories, when he still believed she might grow up untouched by the world he despised. A narrow staircase spiraled downward, walls closing tight. Dust motes spiraled in her breath. Here no one followed, no one even knew to look. The corridor opened into a low room lined with towering shelves, each crammed with papers, broken spines, half-formed poems, abandoned drafts, the cast-offs no heir would have bothered with. And in the center, a single table. On it, resting beneath a cracked glass dome, was a book, the Maps for Wandering Souls, not a replica, not an edition, the original. The margins of its cover were worn thin, the leather soft from years of handling. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she set down the copy she had carried and approached the dome. There, at the base, a tiny engraving, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, 3 interwoven letters, CWM. Clara Wren Marlowe, her father's mark, hidden in plain sight. Above her, the sounds of chaos barely filtered down, faint thuds of falling books, the shrill barks of accusations. The airs were tearing each other apart. Thinking fortune was something you could grab with bloodied fingers. Clara knelt before the table, heart pounding slow and deep. There was no lock on the glass, no security. Just a single folded parchment resting atop the open pages of the atlas. She lifted the dome carefully, the old hinges protesting. The air inside smelled like cedarwood and old ink. The parchment was thin, brittle at the edges. Her hands were steady as she unfolded it. One line written in a tight, deliberate hand, to the one who read not only my words but the spaces between them. "You are my truest heir, not by blood, by understanding." Beneath the text, 2 signatures, Theodore Marlowe, and a single witness, their old housekeeper, gone now these many years. No notary, no seals, only faith, only memory. And yet in the laws of Marlowe House, that was enough. Clara sat back on her heels, the weight of it settling into her bones. It wasn't about fortune. It wasn't about bloodline. It never had been. It was about who could still hear the voice inside the silence. The codicil wasn't hidden among priceless artifacts or in the hands of lawyers. It was left where only she would know to look, in the world of imagined lands. In the place where her father had first taught her that stories were not just told, but lived. Above her, a voice echoed faintly through the stone halls. Found anything yet? Laughter followed, brittle, ugly. Clara folded the parchment carefully, tucking it into her satchel alongside the book that had always been hers, even when the world had called her nothing. She rose, brushing dust from her knees, and walked back toward the light. Each step steady, each breath sure. The wolves upstairs had torn down everything trying to find their prize, and they hadn't even realized. The kingdom was never built for them. The great hall of Marlowe House was no longer a library. It was a battlefield. Books lay gutted across the floor, spines cracked, pages torn like wings ripped from birds. The polished airs, once composed and glistening, were now wild-eyed, ties loosened, sleeves rolled, faces flushed with the sweat of desperation. Clara stepped through the threshold unnoticed at first, the codicil tucked safely in her satchel, her coat dusted with the ashes of forgotten stories. She paused near the doorway, taking in the scene. A woman in a navy dress, one of the Louder cousins, flung a volume across the room with a shriek. "This is madness. How can one piece of paper decide everything?" Another voice snapped back. "Maybe it's already found. Maybe someone's hiding it." Accusations flared like dry grass catching flame, finger-pointing, shouting, threats thinly veiled beneath legalese. In the midst of it, someone noticed Clara. The young man with the phone, the one who had posted wannabe legacy, turned, camera already rising instinctively to capture her standing quietly amid the wreckage. "Well, look who's back from the broom closet," he drawled, voice slick with condescension. "Find anything useful, ghost girl, maybe a nap." Chuckles, bitter and tired, flickered around the room. Clara said nothing. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't tighten her hands. She simply moved forward, the floorboards creaking faintly under her worn boots. At the center of the room, Mrs. Redgrave sat at the long mahogany table, her ledger closed but her spectacles still perched on her nose. She watched Clara approach with an expression carved from marble. Without ceremony, Clara reached into her satchel and pulled out the parchment. The room stilled, breaths caught mid-rush. Laughter choked itself silent. Mrs. Redgrave rose from her chair. She accepted the parchment with both hands, inspecting it under the lamp's amber glow. Her finger traced the delicate script, her mouth pressed into a thinner line. Then she nodded once, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. "It is authentic," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "The codicil is found." The announcement fell into the room like a bomb. A beat of stunned, absolute stillness. Then, "No, that's not possible. She must have forged it. This is a setup." The objections flew, loud and desperate, from all corners of the room. But Mrs. Redgrave raised one gloved hand, palm outward, and the noise faltered. "You were all given equal opportunity," she said coolly. "You chose where to look." She turned toward Clara. "Clara Wren," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "By the instructions of Theodore Marlowe, you are hereby named the sole inheritor of his literary estate. The titles, the royalties, the manuscripts unpublished and unseen by the world, all hers." A man in a checkered blazer stumbled forward, red-faced. "She's nobody. She's not even family." Mrs. Redgrave lifted one eyebrow. "She is exactly who Mr. Marlowe intended." The polished guests looked at Clara now, but not with scorn, with fear, with dawning, reluctant recognition. And Clara, she simply stood, her hands at her sides, her face composed. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She let the truth settle around her like falling ash. The library, torn apart by their own greed, became their mirror. They had searched for fortune and found only their own reflections. The storm of voices faded as the polished heirs fled Marlowe House. One by one, they abandoned the broken library, leaving behind their shredded pride, their torn contracts, and the echoes of their disbelief. Their footsteps clattered down the marble halls, desperate to escape the place that had exposed them so cleanly. Clara remained. The great hall was quiet now, save for the soft sigh of the old building settling into itself, relieved to be rid of pretenders. Sunlight slipped through the cracked stained-glass windows, casting muted ribbons of color across the battered floorboards, touching broken spines and fallen pages like gentle benedictions. Mrs. Redgrave approached, her heels silent on the worn rugs. She placed the official ledger before Clara on the mahogany table, a simple act, yet heavy as a coronation. "You have a great deal of work ahead of you," she said. Not unkindly, not warmly, just a fact. Clara nodded once. She did not open the ledger. Instead, she turned slowly, taking in the library. Rows of shelves bowed under the weight of forgotten masterpieces. Manuscripts hidden in plain sight, letters never sent, ideas never shared, dreams crumbled into margins. Her inheritance wasn't a fortune, it was a responsibility. Clara walked the aisles alone. She ran her fingers lightly over the spines, tracing titles only she recognized, rough drafts her father had never dared publish, notes scribbled in corners, stories meant only for whispered nights and the safe hum of a home built on words. Each touch a promise, each step a vow. This wasn't about owning the legacy, it was about guarding it. At the far end of the hall, near a bay window half-choked with ivy, stood a small writing desk, battered oak, the varnish worn thin by restless hands. Clara set her satchel down. She drew from it a small notebook, leather, cracked, edges softened from years of travel. The same notebook she had carried across cities and forgotten bus stations, across lonely jobs and long nights when she still wondered if she belonged anywhere at all. She opened it to a fresh page, paused, then with deliberate care she wrote, "Guard their stories, guard them well." No title, no signature, just a reminder, a beginning. As she wrote, the late afternoon sun dipped lower, turning the glass panes molten gold. The shadows stretched long and lean across the room, threading between shelves like invisible hands reaching for one last story. Clara closed the notebook. She rose and walked to the grand doors at the entrance. There, inlaid in tarnished brass, was an inscription she had never noticed before. Or perhaps she had always seen it, only now she understood. What you seek is not ownership, but stewardship. She pressed her palm lightly to the metal, the cold sinking into her skin. Behind her the library waited, patient, timeless. It had chosen her, not because she was the strongest or the loudest or the most polished, but because she had listened when no one else had. She had heard the spaces between the words. Clara stepped back into the center of the hall. She looked up at the faded frescoes overhead, muses and monsters entwined in silent battle, and smiled. Small, real. Then she sat at the old oak desk, pulled a sheet of blank paper from a drawer, and began to write, not to claim, not to conquer, but to continue. The library, once a fortress of arrogance, had found its keeper. And as the last light of day bled into twilight, Clara Wren wrote the first words of her new story, one that would never bear only her name, but all the names carried here, between pages, between silences, between breaths.